Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. In our last episode, we navigated the tumultuous waters of the Great Depression and the transformative New Deal. Today, we turn to a conflict that reshaped the globe and America's place within it: World War II. The shadows of the Great War, the war to end all wars, had barely receded when new, more ominous clouds gathered on the international horizon. The 1920s, an era of uneasy normalcy and simmering social tensions within the United States, saw the rise of aggressive, expansionist ideologies abroad. The economic devastation of the Great Depression further destabilized the world order, creating fertile ground for dictators, fascists, and demagogues. America, still grappling with the Depression's impact and largely embracing a policy of isolationism, would find itself inexorably drawn into a global maelstrom. This war wouldn't just be fought on distant battlefields, it would transform American society, its economy, its understanding of civil rights, and its role as the dominant world power. The industrial might, forged in the late 19th century and tested by the New Deal's mobilization efforts, would be unleashed on an unprecedented scale in this war. However, the racial hierarchies, the bitter legacy of Reconstruction, would be starkly illuminated and challenged, both at home and in the segregated ranks of the military abroad. Today, following our chapters, we are going to explore America's journey into the World War II, from the rise of fascism and the origins of the conflict in Europe and the Pacific, through the nation's reluctant entry after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We're going to go over the experiences of the soldiers on multiple fronts, the colossal effort on the home front, the complex intersections of race and gender during wartime, and finally, the dawn of a new and deeply uncertain post-war world. So let's go. In the 1920s and the 1930s, a toxic brew of nationalism, militarism, and economic despair fueled the rise of fascist regimes in Europe and imperial ambitions in Asia. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his black shirts consolidated power, dreaming of a new Roman Empire and invading Ethiopia in 1935. But the most alarming developments were in Germany. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi power rose to power in 1933, capitalizing on economic hardship and the national resentment for Germany being blamed for World War I. As our textbook outlines, Hitler's ideology was rooted in racial supremacy and the pursuit of Lebensraum, or living space, and this led to the rearmament of Germany and a series of aggressive moves: the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the crisis over Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement of 1938, where Britain and France appeased Hitler by ceding the Sudetenland, only emboldened him to take more actions. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared that he had achieved, quote, peace for our time, end quote. But Winston Churchill grimly retorted, quote, you were given a choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. End quote. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Imperial Japan was on the move. Driven by militarism and the need for more resources, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. American public opinion, while critical of Japanese aggression, remained largely isolationist. The final sparks in Europe were the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in August of 1939, a cynical deal that freed Hitler to act, and it followed swiftly by the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France, finally recognizing the futility of appeasement to Hitler or the Nazis, declared war on Germany, and World War II had begun. So while Europe and Asia plunged themselves into war, the United States clung to a policy of neutrality, deeply influenced by the disillusionment following World War I and the domestic focus on fixing the Great Depression that was still happening. The America First Committee, with prominent figures like the aviator Charles Lindbergh, championed isolationism. Lindbergh noted in 1941, quote, "The United States is better situated from a military standpoint than any other nation in the world. These wars in Europe are not wars in which our civilization is defending against some Asiatic intruder. There is no Genghis Khan or Xerxes marching against our domains. This is not a question of banding together to defend the white race against foreign invasion." End quote. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in the mid-1930s before the war, aiming to prevent the U.S. from being drawn into foreign conflicts by prohibiting loans and arms sales to belligerent nations. However, FDR, increasingly alarmed by this Axis aggression, Axis being Germany and Italy and later Japan, they sought to find ways to aid the Allies, Britain and France. The Neutrality Act of 1939 introduced the cash and carry provision, allowing belligerents to buy U.S. arms if they paid, one, in cash, and two, transported them on their own ships, a policy that primarily benefited Britain and France. By 1940, France had fallen and Britain was standing alone, and Roosevelt ramped up support. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 effectively ended American neutrality, allowing the U.S. to lend or lease war materials to any country whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. In August of 41, Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met secretly off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, and issued the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration of war aims that included principles like self-determination, free trade, and freedom from fear and want. This was a clear signal of America's growing alignment with the Allied cause, even before direct military involvement. Earlier in that year, January of 1941, FDR had articulated his vision for a world founded upon four freedoms. Quote, "In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression, everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear, anywhere in the world." The event that shattered American isolationism and catapulted the nation into full-scale war occurred on December 7, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt declared. Japanese carrier-launched planes executed a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans, wounded another 1,200, and crippled the U.S. naval presence in the Pacific. Quote, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." End quote. That was the address of FDR. And on December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States a few days later. America was now fully engaged in a global conflict. Despite the attack by Japan, the Allies, which included the US, Britain, the Free French — remember the French had been invaded and conquered by the Germans by this point — and now the Soviet Union, which had been invaded by Germany in June of 1941, adopted a Germany-first strategy. They recognized Nazi Germany as the more dangerous long-term threat over the Japanese. So American forces began arriving in Europe significantly in numbers in 1942, but first, the fight would take place on African soil. The key campaigns included Operation Torch, which happened in North Africa in 1942 and 43. This was the first of American major offensive in the European theater. U.S. forces under commanders like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton landed in Morocco and Algeria, eventually helping to defeat German and Italian forces in North Africa. Next would come the Italian campaign from 43 to 45. Following the success in North Africa, the Allies invaded Sicily and then the mainland Italy. This was a long, brutal, and attritional campaign fought through difficult mountainous terrain. The U.S. Fifth Army under Mark Clark and the Seventh Army under Patton played significant roles in battles like Salerno and Anzio, eventually leading to the fall of Rome in June of 1944. D-Day is the day. Operation Overlord, June 6, 1944. This was the largest amphibious invasion in history. Allied forces landed on the beaches in Normandy, France, opening up a long-awaited second front against Germany in Western Europe, the other front being in Russia. American troops faced intense German resistance on Omaha and Utah beaches, but ultimately secured a vital beachhead from which to then attack from Europe. The Battle of the Bulge, which was the winter of 1944 and 45, this was Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front. This surprise German attack in the Ardennes forest initially pushed back Allied lines but was ultimately repulsed, thanks in part to the stubborn defense of American units, notably at Bastogne. This battle depleted Germany's remaining offensive capabilities. The war in Europe was characterized by immense logistical challenges, fierce fighting, and heavy casualty. For many American soldiers, it was the first experience of industrial-scale warfare. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these different battles. Your textbook goes into some of them and why they're important, but you need to go check out the World War II Museum in New Orleans if you haven't been there, but definitely check out their website, which has a lot of interesting and amazing stories there. Go check that out. As war is going on in the Western theater, the war in the Pacific was also ramping up. This was the island hopping to victory strategy. So the US faced the daunting task of rolling back the Japanese Empire, which had conquered vast territories across Southeast Asia and a host of Pacific islands. The strategy that was adopted was called island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and seizing strategically important less defended islands to establish forward air bases for the eventual assault on Japan itself. Many of the key battles here include the biggest turning point, the Battle of the Midway, in June of 1942. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy achieved a stunning victory. They sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. This was a crucial turning point. It crippled a lot of Japan's naval air power and ending its offensive capabilities in the Pacific. After this point, Japan went on the defensive. The Battle of Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February of 43, this was the first major American offensive in the Pacific. And this was a brutal 6-month campaign on and around the island of Guadalcanal, and it involved intense jungle warfare and naval battles. It was another hard-fought victory that marked the beginning of the Allied offensive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, this was the largest naval battle in history. It effectively destroyed the Japanese Navy as an offensive force and paved the way for American reconquest of the Philippines. The Battle of Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, happened between February and March of 1945. The U.S. sought to capitalize on the island's airfields by supporting B-29 bomber raids on Japan. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American sacrifice and determination. And lastly, we got the Battle of Okinawa, April to June of 1945. This was the last major battle of World War II. Okinawa saw ferocious Japanese resistance, including mass kamikaze attacks and heavy civilian casualties. The high U.S. casualty rate influenced thinking about the potential cost of invading the Japanese home islands themselves. So the fighting in the Pacific was often characterized, and rightly so, by its particular brutality, its racial animosity on both sides, and the fanatical resistance of Japanese forces. For the millions of Americans who served in World War II, it was a transformative and often harrowing experience. Their letters, their diaries, their oral histories, you can find these at the Library of Congress, paint a vivid picture of life on the front lines and at home. Private Isaac Schwartz, serving in Europe, wrote of the sheer terror and dehumanization of combat during the Battle of the Bulge. Quote, "It is a game of life and death. There are no rules here. We are the gladiators of the 20th century. I find men who a few months ago were supposedly normal human beings, now savages. They have lost all sense of values. All moral codes are forgotten." End quote. He later described the bitter cold and the constant fear. Quote, "How long can a human being exist like this? Living in a hole in the ground like an animal, shells bursting around you constantly. It makes one wonder what it is all about." End quote. On the Pacific front, the experiences were equally brutal. James J. Fahey, a seaman aboard the USS Montpelier, wrote in his diary before action, quote, "The men are all anxious for a fight. I want to see some action too. I hope we have good luck and I come out of it okay." End quote. This initial eagerness gave way to the grim realities of island warfare. Soldiers grappled with boredom, feared, camaraderie, loss, and the stark contrast between the ideals they were fighting for and the brutal realities of war itself. The GI Bill of Rights, passed in 1944, would offer returning veterans unprecedented opportunities for education, housing, and business loan because of the experiences and, of course, winning the war. And this profoundly shaped post-war American society, something we'll get into next episode. Let's turn our attention to the home front. While soldiers fought overseas, the American home front was utterly transformed into the arsenal of democracy, as it was called. The war effort required an unprecedented mobilization of industrial resources and people. As our textbook highlights, federal spending during the war was immense, far exceeding even the programs of the New Deal. And this massive government expenditure definitely ended the Great Depression. The War Production Board, established in 1942 and later led by Donald Nelson, oversaw the conversion of civilian industries into war production. Automobile plants began churning out tanks and planes. Typewriter factories made machine guns. This miracle of production, as it was called, saw American factories produce an astonishing quantity of war materials. The Office of War Mobilization coordinated this vast national effort. The government also managed labor relations through the National War Labor Board, which mediated disputes and sought to prevent strikes in vital industries while war is happening. Most unions, like the AFL under Samuel Gompers, adopted a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war, though some strikes, notably by coal miners, did occur. Union membership actually grew during the war, benefiting from, quote, maintenance of membership clauses. Civilians were called upon to make sacrifices. The Office of Price Administration implemented rationing for scarce goods like gasoline, sugar, coffee, meat, and tires. Scrap drives collected rubber, metal, and paper to be donated for the war effort. Victory gardens sprouted across backyards and public parks across the country. The government financed the war through increased taxes and a massive sale of Liberty bonds. The bonds promoted through intense propaganda campaigns that emphasized it was your patriotic duty to buy these bonds, as well as to donate goods. The Office of War Information, established in 1942, directed the official government propaganda effort. Using posters, radio, films, and newsreel, the Office of War Information, the OWI, aimed to unify public opinion, encourage enlistment as well as bond purchases, promote conservation of resources as well as its donation, and to demonize the enemies we face. Iconic pictures urged Americans to, quote, dig on for victory or save waste fats for explosives, and reminded them that, quote, loose lips sink ships. George Creel, who was in charge of the propaganda from World War I, had set some precedents for World War II, but the OWI's reach was even greater than what Creel could muster because of the new technology. And using these progressive era persuasion tactics actually worked. This often led to intense anti-German and anti-Japanese sentiments at home. Now, World War II dramatically expanded opportunities for many Americans. And the first we're going to look at is American women. With millions of men in uniform and overseas, women particularly stepped into roles previously closed to them because of their gender. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, inspired by a popular song and a Norman Rockwell's famous painting, symbolized the millions of women who entered the defense industries, working in factories and shipyards and aircraft plants, building the weaponry and the machinery necessary to win the war. Oral histories from women who worked these jobs reveal their pride and the challenges they faced. One, Rosie, Inez Sauer, described her work at Boeing, quote, I was a riveter. I was terrified at first, but you just did it. It was your patriotic duty, end quote. Another, Juanita Allen, recalled, quote, it was the first time I ever had money in my pocket that I had made, end quote. They often faced lower pay than men doing the same job, and skepticism about their abilities because they were women, but their contributions were undeniable. We don't win the war without them. Women actually also served in the military in unprecedented numbers. The Women's Army Corps, the WAC, and the Navy Women's Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, the Coast Guard SPARs, and the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs, provided vital support services, freeing up men for combat. Over 150,000 women served in the WACs alone. Army and Navy nurses served with distinction, often close to the front lines, seeing the terrible carnage that war brings. So while the war opened new doors, it also reinforced traditional gender roles in some way, with women often encouraged to return to domestic life after the war. However, the experience of wartime employment, having money in your pocket for the first time, and the services that they had done had a lasting impact. It challenged the pre-war notions about women's capabilities, and it contributed to the later feminist movements asking and then demanding and then protesting for better rights. For African Americans, World War II was fought on two fronts, against fascism abroad and against racism at home. This sentiment was encapsulated by the Wwii campaign, launched by the British Courier, a leading black newspaper. Quote, we, as colored Americans, are determined to protect our country, our form of government, and the freedoms which we hope to enjoy. We are also determined to achieve our full rights as citizens in this country. Therefore, let us call for a double V. V for victory over our enemies on the battlefields abroad, and V for victory over our enemies on the home front, the enemies of intolerance, prejudice, and race hatred, end quote. Over 1 million African Americans served, but they did so in segregated military, often facing discrimination and being relegated to service and supply units mostly. However, there were exceptional service members, like the units of the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of black fighter pilots who achieved a distinguished combat record, escorting bombers over Europe, as well as disproving racist myth about their incapabilities to fly planes. They did so amazingly. There was also the 761st Tank Battalion that also distinguished itself in service. On the home front, the Great War accelerated the Great Migration that we had talked about previously, and African Americans from the rural South moved again in mass numbers to industrial cities in the north and west, seeking again opportunities economically in the defense industry, as well as to escape the racism and violence of the South. However, that didn't always go as planned, as they often faced continued discrimination in employment and housing in the North. Labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941 to protest this racial discrimination in defense hiring. This pressure led President Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8801, banning racial discrimination in defense industries, as well as creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee. While the FEPC had limited enforcement powers, it was a significant symbolic step of the government recognizing the racial tensions. But these racial tensions boiled over in several cities. There were race riots. The Detroit race riot in 1943, sparked by conflicts over jobs and housing, as well as fueled by white resistance to blacks having jobs and advancement, resulted in 34 deaths, 25 of them African American, and hundreds of injuries before federal troops restored order. Similar riots occurred in places like Harlem and other northern cities. The experience of Japanese Americans in World War II represents one of the starkest violations of civil liberties in American history. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, fueled by wartime hysteria, as well as some long-standing anti-Japanese racism and prejudice, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942. This order authorized the forced removal and incarceration into concentration camps of over 110,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, from the West Coast into these internment camps. Eiko Herzig Yoshinaga, interned as a teenager, recalled this, quote, "We were simply told to report to a particular place at a particular time with only what we could carry. It was a period of such confusion and such terror, really. To be uprooted like that, to lose everything you had worked for, was just devastating." End quote. The Supreme Court in Korematsu versus U.S. in 1944 upheld the legality of the internment policy, citing military necessity. Justice Robert Jackson issued a powerful dissent, warning that the ruling, quote, "lies about like a loaded weapon ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need," end quote. Decades later, the U.S. government formally apologized and provided reparations, acknowledging the grave injustice of interning Japanese citizens. Despite this treatment, many Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, had served with extraordinary bravery in the U.S. military, most notably the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, which became one of the most decorated units in U.S. history. Mexican Americans also faced discrimination. The Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1943 saw U.S. servicemen attack young Mexican Americans wearing distinctive zoot suits, fueled by racist prejudice and sensationalist media coverage. Police often arrested the victims rather than the attackers. Simultaneously, the Bracero program, initiated in 1942, brought hundreds of thousands of Mexican laborers to the U.S. to fill agricultural labor shortages, often under exploitative conditions, and all of this, again, fueled more and more racial prejudice. So as we can see, the home front wasn't just unified against common enemies abroad. It was actually quite divisive at home too, as barriers, racial or gender, were being challenged. As the war raged on, horrific reports of the Nazi regime's systematic extermination of European Jews and other targeted groups, what we know as the Holocaust, news of that began to reach the Allies. While the full scale of this genocide was not understood by the general public until after the war, the U.S. government and Jewish organizations had increasing evidence of mass killings by 1942. The American response was tragically inadequate. Anti-Semitism at home, restrictive immigration laws like the quota systems established in the 20s, and a focus on winning the war above all else contributed to a reluctance to take decisive action to rescue European Jews. Finally, in January 1944, President Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board, largely due to pressure from the Treasury Department officials. The WRB, despite limited resources and operating late in the war, did manage to save some lives, estimated in the tens of thousands, through various relief and rescue efforts, often working with neutral governments and private organizations. However, for millions, help came too late or not at all. The liberation of Nazi concentration and death camps by Allied soldiers in 1945 exposed the full, unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust to the world. This is your chance to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Their website will go into more detail about all of this. It is a terrible, horrible part of the history. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day, following Germany's unconditional surrender after Hitler's suicide and the fall of Berlin to Soviet forces. In the Pacific, despite the devastating conventional bombing campaigns against Japanese cities, Japan refused to surrender and fought on. We had a new president. President Harry S. Truman took office after FDR's death in April of 1945. And he made the momentous decision to use a newly developed atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. When Japan refused to surrender, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. Announcing the Hiroshima bombing, Truman stated, quote, "It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. If they do not accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." End quote. The Japanese surrendered on August 15th, 1945, which was VJ Day, officially ending World War II. The post-war world was vastly different. The old European empires were weakened or collapsing. Out of the shadows and the rubble, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant superpowers, their wartime alliance quickly giving way to suspicion and ideological conflict. Conferences at Yalta in February of 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were present, was very different from the conference in Potsdam in July and August of 1945, where Roosevelt had given way to Truman and Churchill was no longer the prime minister. And this new conference attempted to shape the post-war world, addressing issues like the division of Germany, the fate of Eastern Europe, and the war against Japan. However, these meetings also revealed the deep divisions that would soon lead to one of our next episodes, the Cold War. In an effort to prevent future global conflicts, the United Nations was established in 1945, with the U.S. playing a leading role in its creation, vastly different than the League of Nations, which the United States never joined. Domestically, the GI Bill of Rights provided returning veterans with unprecedented opportunities for education, vocational training, home and business loans, fueling post-war prosperity and suburbanization, our next topic in our next episode. World War II had cost tens of millions of lives, and it wrought unparalleled destruction upon this world. But it also fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power, accelerated social changes within the United States, and ushered in an era of American global leadership, an era that was fraught with new challenges and responsibilities. The end of World War II marked not just the conclusion of a devastating conflict, but the beginning of a new epoch. The United States was now a global superpower, would soon find itself locked in a decades-long Cold War with the Soviet Union, a struggle that would define much of the latter half of the 20th century. Join me next time on Star-Spangled Studies when we explore the anxieties and the transformations of the early Cold War era. I'll see y'all in the past.